Okay, everyone. I do still see a couple of folks joining here and there, but it is a few minutes past 1, so we'll go ahead and get started. First and foremost, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us here for today's webinar. The subject matter today is going to be what's new in B2W operations. So again, should be a relatively straightforward webinar today. Should take probably about 25 to 30 minutes, depending on questions. Just a couple of quick introductions. My name is Tom Willey. I'm the Senior Solutions Engineer for B2W. I started at the company back in 2006. Started at the company as a product trainer, and then worked my way into being the implementation team leader, and then became a solutions engineer back in 2009. On the webinar today with me, kind of riding shotgun, is Anthony Salvatore, who is also a solutions engineer. He started the company back in 2013, took a similar path, implementation, and then solutions engineer. Anthony will be monitoring the questions panel. So as we go through the presentation today, folks are encouraged to ask any questions that they like. So there's a questions panel as part of this webinar session. Feel free to ask any of those questions right in there. I just saw a question come up. Hi, Ashley. Those questions will be answered by either Anthony or myself. For the most part, we try to answer the questions directly in the webinar. If it's a question that is relatively niche or applies to a small number or is very off-topic, we may answer that offline. But for the most part, if folks ask a question that really applies to everyone, we'll take that question and answer it within the webinar itself through me. So feel free to ask away. And thanks, Anthony, for your support. I'm going to just set the stage here with an agenda. We'll kind of go through PowerPoint for just a few minutes and get into some of the details. But these are the 4 features that we'll be looking at. Weekly employee hours to date on field logs, and something called Grid View. Grid View is not actually a new feature, but it's been so popular and it's pretty powerful, we wanted to show it off as part of this What's New webinar as well. Probably the biggest one for maintain users is the ability to augment and create work orders on a mechanic's tablet. So no longer requiring connectivity to do that. And then last but not least, there is a minor change to the preventive maintenance program that adds some additional information for folks, and it's going to set the groundwork for a little bit more functionality coming down the road soon. So just a little more detail on each of these features before we jump in and actually show them in the software. Weekly employee hours to date has been a big request from our user base, and really the need here is, as a foreman, if I am entering hours for my employees and I'm using the overtime or double time capabilities, I really need to know how many hours that employee has had so far that week, so I know when they cross the threshold into overtime. And previously, they couldn't really do that easily. They'd have to run a report or just ask the guy, hey, how many hours do you have? Well, now we've included the ability to see within the field log total number of hours for a given employee that they've had that week. And they'll be able to see it right on screen and assist in that allocation of, okay, they've crossed either the 40-hour mark or whatever it is for that region, and be able to enter it. And that functionality is available both on the browser version as well as the tablet, and I'll show you both. Grid View was actually released previous to the most current release, 17.3. It was in 17.2. But it was a huge enhancement that really adds a great way for users to quickly enter in information on the mobile app for track. So folks had a lot of different ways of entering in information, so they could enter in production quantities for one production account and employee and equipment hours for that account on one screen, or they could go to an employee and add hours for all accounts, or go to equipment and add for all accounts. But what people kept saying was, you know, as fast as this is, it would really be even better if we could just enter all of this on one screen. And essentially a grid-style view where I could see all my production accounts, employees, and equipment, and just kind of tap on all the things that I want and blast in hours. And so we were able to release that, and it's dramatically reduced the amount of time that it takes to enter in information on the field log. It's pretty exciting. Similarly, for a lot of our maintain users, they really liked the functionality of the tablet where a mechanic could go out into the field and quickly work on work orders that were assigned to them. But people kept telling us over and over again, look, the reality of the dynamic environment that we're in is I give a guy a work order and he goes out to the job site, and he's either going to be told that the machine I sent him to fix has 2 other things wrong on it that he didn't know about, or he goes to fix one machine, and in addition to that, there's another machine on the same job site that needs attention. And we're able to handle that workflow, but it was a little bit clunky in that they had to communicate with the office. So previous to this version, I had to create a request. The office could then add it to an existing work order or create a new work order, and then the mechanic would have to sync that down for him to be able to start working on it directly on the tablet. And for folks that didn't have any connectivity, that could be problematic. So we augmented the tablet so that now mechanics can both add work orders to an existing add requests to an existing work order, or they would be able to simply make up a new work order. Looks like we just got a question. Is there a separate security for this if you want to allow a particular mechanic to not be able to create their own work orders? Good question. Yes, there is. So there are security settings within the user profiles. So within a mechanic, you would be able to say if they're allowed to create or modify or delete any of the work orders. And it has the same sets of security permissions as other areas where it could be by business unit or branch. Good question. The last one here is our maintain program enhancements. So for folks that, again, have the maintain system, there are preventive maintenance programs that you can set up, and these PMs have multiple items in them. When you're working on a machine, when you go to create a work order, one of the things the system will do is show you any of those PM items and give you the opportunity to trigger it. So even though that PM might be due at, say, 50,000 miles or 100,000 miles or 10,000 hours or whatever it is, if it's close enough, you can make the decision to trigger that PM early. And sometimes that would potentially cause a little confusion if someone saw a PM that would come in and it wasn't quite timed based on the meter. So we've now allowed people to see if that particular PM item was triggered manually or triggered by the system. And we've also added a couple of other enhancements where, as part of the machine itself, if you go in and look at the machine and the PMs assigned to it, you'll be able to see when the next PM should be triggered. And the reason that we've done that is, A, it gives people a little more context, but B, being able to store when it should have been triggered is going to be an important piece for a KPI that we have coming up, or a key performance indicator, to help people better understand how well they're doing on their preventive maintenance. So that's kind of laying out what the features are going to do. Let's go ahead and see them in action. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to leave the world of PowerPoint here, and we're going to start with the first feature, which is the ability to see weekly hours to date for a given employee. Now, as is the case with many of our features, or better to say many of our new features, they're turned off by default. One of the things that people like about our products overall is that the user interface is very clean and very straightforward. And so if you simply add new features all the time, even though those features may not be used by every user, you end up cluttering the screen and making the user interface a lot more complex. So we have a lot of these features that are turned off by default, so you can choose if you want to have them. Users that either don't know about the functionality or don't care aren't surprised by a sudden change in the interface. So one of the first things I'll show you is, to take advantage of this feature, you have to turn it on within business units. So again, for folks that don't have to deal with the back-end stuff, business units are a way of being able to carve up the company into smaller pieces, but it's also where you can essentially set up and change what the field log looks like, the information that's on it, both columns, headers, and information that's in it. And so to make this feature show up, it's essentially a column that you turn on. So in the employees section of the field log, you could enable a column called week-to-date hours. You could give it a custom name if you want. You could determine where you want it to show up in the list. But just by adding that column, you would then enable the functions. Now, in addition to being able to just turn it on or off, there's some other choices that you can make. So for example, you could determine which day of the week that is considered your start date. So for some companies, the vast majority of them are either they start on a Monday or start on a Sunday, but this allows you to pick what do you consider the start of the week. Is it Sunday or Monday? Or if you're a niche case, you could set any one of these days to be the start of the week. In addition to that, you could also decide what hours you want to include in those totals. So I have everything turned on, production hours, time and materials hours, and overhead hours. But if I click on this drop-down, you could decide which combination of those you want. Because, for example, in overhead hours, you might have either all or most of your overhead hours don't attribute to really the time that would get them to overtime. So if I'm capturing overhead hours for lunch or meetings and those are unpaid, then I don't want those to count in the weekly total, and I can turn them off. So that's how I would turn on the functionality. What I'll do now is save out of here, and I'll just go and show you a field log where that's turned on. So this is a field log here for the, it's for the 24th for yesterday, but it represents a field log that's kind of midweek where I've already done a lot of work, maybe starting on Sunday or whatever it is. So now when I scroll down to the employees area, here's a list of employees, and I can see here week-to-date hours. Now it gives me some basic information, so I could just see the number right off the bat, but if I hover my cursor, I actually get a more detailed breakdown. So I can see here, it breaks it out into production, time and materials, and overhead. So I can see it's 22 hours of production, no T&M, but 4 hours of overhead. Similarly, if I hover over here, I could see it's 12 hours of production, 6 of time and materials, and 2 of overhead. So quite a bit more detail, which again helps foremen when they're filling out the field log to know what happened prior to today, so I can put the hours in the right buckets if I have those overtime decisions to make. So that's what it looks like on the browser version. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over and show you the tablet, and that'll let us do 2 things. One, it'll let you see the same functionality there in terms of the weekly hours summary, but I'll also be able to transition into showing you what the grid view looks like. So I've got my tablet up here. I've synced a little while ago. I've got my latest and greatest. I'm going to open up that same field log. And what you'll see on the left-hand side of the page, first of all, there's the grid view. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But if I go to my employees, I would be able to go to a given employee, and I would be able to see the same information. So there's week-to-date hours. And it shows me the total, but also you see that little arrow. If I tap on the arrow, it gives me that same level of detail and breakout. I had a good question here from Tracy. Will the week-to-date hours pull from all field logs or just that particular foreman's field logs? It will pull from all field logs. So it's really associating it with the employee, not just the foreman. And so now the only caveat to that is if you're on the tablet and maybe someone else has hours that haven't been synced to the server yet, then it won't see those. But it will see the hours for any field logs associated with that employee that have been synced and that the tablet is able to view. Or if you're on the browser version, it would be all field logs that were in the server. Great question. So that is, again, week-to-date hours for employees. What I'm going to do now is show you, again, that grid view. So the grid view is, again, additional functionality that's simply turned on. This is one of the features that is kind of starts as on automatically. You can't really turn it off. And the reason is because it's just another method of entering the hours. So you can still continue to do the same method that you're doing now, going into employees or production hours. So it's not an instead of. This grid view is just in addition to what you already have. You could choose to use it or choose to not use it. But I'm going to throw this into edit mode here, and then I'm just going to move over to the grid just so you can see it essentially arranges everything all on one screen. So now, within the grid view, I could enter in production quantities at the top. I can enter in employee and equipment hours. And just to kind of finish up and continue the week-to-date hours, you'll see the little I, the information icon. Even in the grid view, I would be able to see that breakout of information. So I can see total hours and the same information that I would get in the other views of the field log. So very consistent. The grid view itself allows you to enter in pretty much anything that you see here. I could also add more. So even from this screen, I could add jobs. I could add production accounts, more employees, more equipment. But once I've added everything that I need, I could just tap on what I want to change. So I just tap on, say, paving. I could put in 100 tons of paving and 500 square yards of grading. and or I could now start to enter hours. So essentially anything that I tap on, I then have the opportunity to put hours into. Well, so let's just say I wanted to put in the paving guys here, so Aaron Baker and the Blawnox and the grader operator, they all just spent 5 hours working on paving. Notice that as soon as I tap on any of those fields, over on the right, this little keypad kind of pokes its head out. Now, it's not available yet. It stays off to the side because I could potentially have more tracking accounts here, and I don't want to cover it up with the keypad. But when I'm ready to enter data, I just tap on the little triangle, and it completely pops out, or I can now say, okay, 5 hours. And I could put that 5 hours just to employees, or I could tap on copy hours to equipment and apply, and it's pushed the hours completely to those 3 entities that I chose. Now, in addition to that, I could really choose anything on screen. So I could choose non-contiguous stuff as well. I could say, you know what, you and you and you and you, non-contiguous meaning across multiple tracking accounts, and I could say you're all 3 hours, let's just say. And again, I could copy that to the equipment. Now, the other thing that I could do is I could select an entire cost code all at once. So if I just wanted to go boom, boom, boom down the line and enter in all my cost code data, I could just say, okay, well, I put in my quantity there, and then I tap on that, and it highlights everybody in that cost code, and I'll say you all got 2 hours. So extremely fast and efficient to enter in time for a crew on screen. I could even go so far as to say, well, if this whole crew just split their time among 2 cost codes, I can highlight both cost codes all at once and just say, you know what, 5 hours for employees and equipment, and pow. I could have just filled out, the time for 20 or 30 people and 10, 12, 15 pieces of equipment all at the same time. I can also filter the view down, so if this is too much information, if you have a larger crew, you could actually come up here and tap on Show Resources here, and you could simply say, well, I just want to show only employees, or I just want to show only equipment. And you can also choose how you want to organize them, resources A to Z, resources Z to A, equipment first, etc. Right now it's employees first. So lots of options for you to be able to see all the information on screen as part of that grid view, significantly faster in order to enter that. So that's the grid view. So those are really the 2 main enhancements that have been made to B2W operations on the track side. What we'll do now is we'll transition over into B2W maintain to look at the other features there. So I'm going to move into maintain here. I'm going to start and go into the requests area. And we're going to go a little bit out of order from the PowerPoint. We'll just very quickly look at, looks like another question came in. Does the multiple sections for data enter work with the laptop? So I'm assuming that means, is there a grid view for the laptop or browser version? The answer is no, because in essence, when you look at the browser version of the field log, it's closer to that idea of a grid view. So you could see all of your information on screen. You can't highlight multiple things all at once the way you can on the tablet, but you can physically see all the employees and equipment and the production on one screen. And that was really the goal. So continuing on here, I'm going to just quickly show you those maintenance program enhancements. And so we've kind of added some additional information. If I look at something like this excavator here, 500-hour service, you can see when it was generated and how it was generated by Tom Willey. So that means a user said, I'm going to go ahead and do that particular PM a little bit early, and they generated it on 10/23. But if you look at a different one that was generated by the system itself, like this oil change here, you can see that it was generated by the system, and it was generated at this particular mileage on this particular date. So you now can essentially differentiate between the manually generated ones. So if you see a PM that was generated earlier than you think it might have been, you can understand that it's basically because of a user at that time. Now, one of the other things that this is going to do, if I then look at the, like for example, a piece of equipment, another piece of information that was added as part of this is when you look at a PM, it can tell you when the next one is going to trigger. So in essence, the system knows in advance the time at which it should be completed. So if I look at my programs and look at a given piece of it, like this 100-hour service, I can see when it is due on. And what we're going to be enhancing the system to do in the future is add another KPI in order to show how close you are completing your PMs in comparison to when they are actually due. So for example, here, if I go back to, you've probably seen the maintenance dashboard. There's kind of an internal hard-coded dashboard for the maintenance managers. But for folks that don't know, we also have another maintain dashboard that focuses on maintenance-specific KPIs or key performance indicators. And we have, the first 4 that came out are things like a percentage of emergency items, percentage of planned, preventive, and unplanned. And then we have what's called schedule compliance. And really what that is the ability to see when you are scheduling your work orders. So if you say a work order is due on the 28th, you can see here, am I completing my work orders by those dates? So if I complete it by the 28th, it counts as completed by due date. If I don't, it counts against it. And so now that we have that, when is the PM supposed to be completed, stored within the system, we'll be adding another KPI here to show you when you are completing your PMs. Are you completing them when you're supposed to or before, or if you're letting it go beyond? So that'll be a great piece of information to see. Looks like we had another question come in. Oh, that looks like another offline question. I'll let Anthony handle that one. So I'll continue on here. That's the maintenance piece, the preventive maintenance program item. What we'll do now is show you the kind of the last big piece of functionality, which are work orders on a tablet. So again, previously mechanics had to kind of go through the main office and have them create work orders, put them on a schedule, or change them in order to work. So in that scenario, I might have done something like I had this item come in for working on a Bobcat. I can see here the throttle needs adjusting, so I assign it to Gary Adams. Great. Gary Adams grabs his tablet. He goes out into the field. I'm just going to move the tablet over here. So Gary is now out in the field. He's next to the Bobcat, and the operator comes up to him and says, hey, just so you know, in addition to the throttle, there seems to be something wrong with the hydraulics too. Prior to this version, he could make a request, but then the office would have to add it to the field log. Well, now I could actually directly from the mobile app, I could just say I want to add an item. And if I click Add Item here, I would see any other repair requests. So even if, say, a track user had created a repair request and then I show up and someone tells me about it, I would see that request here and I could select it and add it to the work order. But if the person is simply telling me about that request, I could just say, okay, well, I'll just make that as a new request. So I'm just going to say, hydraulics need checking. And then I could fill out a couple of extra pieces of information that I need in order to get this to be a valid work order item, like type. I'm going to say this is an inspection. And then I'm going to scroll down and say it needs to be done at the Steeplegate Mall, maybe because that's where I am. And that's it. And I could then validate and submit it. And so in essence, when I do that, it would allow me to send that work order item right into the work order. And so now it's good to go, item number 2. So from the field, the ability to do that. The other scenario would be if I go back to the work orders. Again, somebody could say, hey, while you're out here working on the Bobcat, did you know that our dozer just broke down? And that dozer is really important. You got to work on that now. So there would really, in the past, be no way to do that other than to call the office, have to make a work order. Now from the field, I even have it right here, bright shiny new button here, new work order. So again, I could click new work order. I could find the piece of equipment. Let's say it's a dozer. It's a D10 or D4 or it's D9. Then I could just say, thing broke down. Don't know why yet. I could give it a priority, and then right from here, I could go to work order items. There are none. Similarly, I could add an item, so it's the same workflow. If someone had already submitted a work order item through the track mobile app or through the browser or if the mechanic, someone had called into the office, they'd create a request, I could add that item, or I could just say, well, there are no items, I'm going to make a new request. And I'm just going to, start by checking the engine or whatever it is. So I fill out the rest of this information here, call this a repair, see if we get them all. Now what's great about this, when I create a new work order, I'm going to validate and submit that. I'm going to go to the work order and say, okay, we're good to go. So that work order is now ready. I'm going to validate and submit it, and then I'm just going to sync it back to the office. Now when I do that, these work orders that I've created, they in essence will show up within the system. So I'll actually see that work order here if I just do a sync. That will show up on the schedule, and I'll be able to see that information on screen. So that essentially, even though the guy in the field is kind of creating his own work orders, the guys in the office would know that he's working on those. He'd be able to see that from his schedule. Those are the kind of major pieces of functionality here. I'll kind of leave the system open here for a couple more questions. In the meantime, I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint for just a couple of reminders here. Any questions and answers we'll take care of here offline or as they come in. But just one last thing for a reminder, these webinars are always recorded, and the webinars are made available online. So if you're attending and maybe you had a colleague that needed to see this information, they will be able to access it themselves. We generally post the recordings within a few days after the webinar, so it should be by the end of the week. For any folks that maybe saw things that they don't currently have access to, so if you're a track user and you liked what you saw in Maintain, feel free to call the sales department. We can set you up with a demonstration. Or if you've just seen a lot of new functionality that you aren't familiar with within the elements that you own, we could set you up with more training. For clients that own these products and maybe are unfamiliar with how to turn them on, you can always contact the support department as well. So we'll email out a link to the recorded session. And again, thank you everyone for joining us, and feel free to look out for future webinars. We should have a whole series of them coming up. Thanks for attending, and hope to see you at the next one.